Hi there, this is Coach Red Pill, and we're doing today our book stream. The book stream today is about Ernest Hemingway's The First 49 Stories, and I want to welcome you all and welcome my guest, Dr. Benway.
Hello, everyone. How's it going?
Uh, it's just going to be us two because unfortunately two other YouTubers whose names will not be mentioned promised to do reading and they didn't. I guess not many people are into Hemingway and that's unfortunate. But anyway, hopefully you guys who are listening to me to this show are going to enjoy it. Now I'm going to be cutting out my image in just a little bit, or just now as a matter of fact, because it sort of like interferes with the broadcast and I want you to be able to hear everything properly. It's more important for you to hear it than to see my ugly mug. So I'm just going to turn that off right now, if you all don't mind. And we'll just get started. So, Dr. Benway, do you want to take it away first with an intro to Hemingway?
Yeah, I think Hemingway, I'm going to just jump right into it because I'm thinking about my own experiences as a student, as a reader. Hemingway always seems to me, at least for my generation, I'm unfortunately a millennial, is one of those writers where you know about him, but likely have not read about him as much as you should have. Now, I think we're all fairly familiar with the titles of his books, be they The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, definitely The Old Man and the Sea. And we have a conception of him as a quote unquote masculine writer. I think the term that I remember being used to compare him to other writers that are his contemporaries are the red-faced writers versus the white-faced or pale-faced writers. Red-faced writers being the very masculine guys who are literally outdoors, hence why they have the red face, versus the pale-faced writers who are sort of resigned back, a little bit more quote-unquote intellectual and contemplative. Fitzgerald probably being an example of a pale-faced writer. But by and large, for whatever reason, reading Hemingway stories in a sort of profound or at least deep kind of way didn't really come up when I was going through my literary education system. In fact, it was only by precipitation of this conversation that I actually got to read some of these short stories in a deeper way than I had before. And thank God we did, because I think, more so even than the books, I think there's a sharpness to these prose that you get in the short story that's in a concentrated kind of way, and in a way that his style, which arguably is a forebearer to a kind of minimalist, or for lack of a better term, action-oriented style, which is just, perfect media for what he had to say. I think, Hemingway's probably even closer to you than he is to me, Coach. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, when I was growing up, Hemingway was required reading, and he was held up as the exemplar of what you're supposed to do insofar as writing is concerned. Now, let's just back up a little bit about Hemingway, and I'm going to go a little bit through his biography. Now, Hemingway was born in 1899 in, I think it was Kansas, and he was I think he was the second or third child of 6 children, and he came from a prominent, well-to-do family. His father was a doctor, a very successful one. His mother was some sort of society lady. They were educated people. And he himself was well educated by his parents, though he never went to college, I believe. What he did was in 1917, at the age of 18, he went to Italy and he volunteered for the taxi service, the ambulance service. And he was severely wounded in combat. He was known at the time to be a physically very brave individual. And he was, what you'd call outdoorsy all of his life. Now, in 1918, I believe, as I said, he was severely wounded. He suffered, he almost lost a leg, and he also suffered a deep wound on his forehead. You can actually see it in just about every picture. There's like on the very crown of his head, there's like an indentation there. That was shrapnel. And he was traumatized by his experiences in Italy. And and it would become a dominant theme of his life, because he was known all of his life growing up as sort of high-strung, rather nervous. One could call him neurotic in the very same way that you would call Woody Allen neurotic. Hemingway had a high degree of neuroticism and here is the interesting thing, and what I find really compelling about him. You see, today we are sort of taught that expressing neuroticism is sort of like a good thing. And the fashion today is to express your feelings, to express your anxieties constantly, in your tweets and your Facebook updates and all the rest of it. That this is the way you ought to be, of constantly sharing, quote unquote, and expressing your weaknesses, your deficiencies, your neuroses, quite frankly. Whereas Hemingway grew up in a completely different generation, and he himself adopted the notion of grace under pressure, of submerging his feelings of fear, his feelings of anxiety, for the sake of presenting to the world a strong face, not a mask, but rather a face of a resolute face, the face of a man of action, the man who would not allow his personal feelings to paralyze him. Now, this, of course, goes completely against the grain and against the fashion, the current fashion. And this attitude, this quote unquote manly attitude, which today is called toxic masculinity, for crying out loud, well, it served him in good stead, because all of his life, Hemingway would dive into activities that frightened him. And it was his desire to overcome his fear and to incorporate his fear and to grow above it, to grow beyond it, that led to his development both as an artist and as a man. Now, when he was young, after the war, he worked as a journalist in Toronto, I believe, the Toronto Star, if I'm not mistaken. And it was the Toronto Star, he somehow convinced them to send him to Paris. Paris at the time, after the First World War, was exceedingly cheap for Americans or any American, earning a Canadian paycheck, which was the case with Hemingway. And what happened was that in Paris, he had the responsibility of filing one story every week, which, if you think about it, it's pretty damn easy. And so he had all this time to not only explore Paris and meet a lot of other intellectuals, other modernists, other authors like James Joyce, like Ezra Pound, meet all these people, not to mention people like Gertrude Stein, who, apart from being an author, introduced him to a wide set of people. He had the opportunity in Paris to hone his craft as a writer. And what happened, and here's the interesting thing, and here is how an artist expresses his emotion, his emotional state, by way of his art form. Hemingway developed what came to be known as the iceberg theory of writing. And this theory is very important because it's with us today. Hemingway, the idea was to write a story whereby you would see the surface events that were transpiring, but what was truly meaningful was not on the page, but beneath it, below it, like an iceberg. An iceberg, of course, you see a little bit of the iceberg, but the vast majority of the mass of the iceberg is underwater. The same idea held true with his art form. He would deliberately try to create a very polished style that was seemingly very simple. And as a writer, I can tell you that it's exceedingly difficult to write in a Hemingway style, because that especially early Hemingway, because he would deliberately eliminate all adjectives and anything that required a subjective meaning. And so his entire prose tended to be strictly of action. He ran. It wouldn't be, he ran quickly or he ran casually. No, he ran or he jogged, but there was never any adjectives. Like I said, especially in his early work. His early work was collected in a collection of short stories called In Our Time, which was championed by the right people, because Hemingway was an acknowledged charmer. He knew how to operate, and he knew how to get his work read by the right people. And he became friends, drinking buddies, as a matter of fact, with James Joyce, and he became close to Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound, of course, the Jewish anti-Semite and fascist who was, arrested and thrown in the crazy house after what he did during the Second World War. But he was also a man of exceptionally good literary taste. He discovered and encouraged James Joyce. He discovered Hemingway and encouraged him as well. And, Hemingway and Joyce, radically different styles, of course. One almost Baroque and the other minimalist and just stripped down. And well, what happened with Hemingway was that his acquaintances in Paris got his work noted. And he, at the time, short story writing was the way for a young writer to get noticed and eventually make a very good living. Look at F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was a contemporary of Hemingway's and who became friends with Hemingway at one point, but then they had a falling out, but that's for later. The point is, you see, this writer, Hemingway, he expressed his need to submerge his anxiety and neuroses in his prose. Because just as his prose had a very strong masculine surface, and yet underneath it, there was this element of profound feeling and emotion. The same would go for his life. His life was reflected in his art, and his art in his life. It was very much of a piece, and that's why Hemingway's biography is of such interest, especially his early life. Later, he would get married and all the rest of it, and just drink too much and fish a lot and all the rest of it. But what's important is to understand that he was a highly neurotic individual, naturally so. His trauma in World War One, and it was indisputably a trauma, and it was indisputably, there is no question that he behaved in a heroic way. He was a war hero, whether his critics like it or not. He was a man of exceptional physical bravery. And yet that physical bravery, I don't want to say masked, because when you say the word mask, it gives an underlying negative impression. But he submerged his anxiety and fear behind this strong surface of strength and decision and purpose, which led him to act heroically, and yet at the same time left him profoundly scarred by his experiences in World War One, and which found expression, as I said, in his work. Now, I would venture to say that the best exemplar of this style of Hemingway's is Big Two-Hearted River. Now, in this story, it's about a character named Nick Adams. Nick Adams is a clearly autobiographical figure. And Nick Adams goes hunting, he goes hunting and fishing in Montana, I think. I forget actually if he hunts and fishes or just fishes. Let's say he just fished. Actually, he just fished, I think. Anyway, the story is really boring because in the sense that not a hell of a lot happens. He goes fishing, he catches a fish, he skins it and all the rest of it, and he thinks it's good, and it's very simple language, very simple declarative sentences. And yet, even though on a surface level it's very boring, the prose becomes hypnotic, and you can't stop reading it, because you are almost from the first sentence aware that a great deal is going on under the surface. And of course, what's going on under the surface is that Nick has returned from the First World War, after a nearly fatal injury, and he's trying to emotionally get over this trauma that he suffered, and that's why he's fishing. And what's going on is Nick Adams is trying to still the emotional vortex that is going on within him by way of this little camping trip that he's on, that is being described in the story. And so you see the subtlety of it and the artfulness of it. And here's something else that's very important. See, today, Hemingway is despised. He's looked down upon, and people think that he's blah, 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 right? But the thing is, see, today's literature mimics all of the best qualities of Hemingway. Because one thing that you must understand is that there is a before Hemingway and an after Hemingway in terms of prose styling. Because his prose was so curt, so clean, so devoid of any kind of unnecessary curlicue. Read, for instance, compare Henry James to Hemingway. And Henry James seems Victorian, seems, too much decoration, too much acrobatics with the prose, just trying too hard. Whereas Hemingway seems natural, almost like the flow of a river. In a weird way, Hemingway seems invisible, even though he's, pungently there in terms of his prose style. But the contrast between Henry James and Hemingway, that is the before Hemingway and the after Hemingway, it's notorious. And what's interesting is that every writer after Hemingway tried to mimic Hemingway in their early work. Famously, William Faulkner, in his first novel, Soldier's Pay, it was deliberately trying to mimic Hemingway, and it failed. Okay, a lot of people have said that F. Scott Fitzgerald started failing as a writer, especially as a novelist, in his desire to copy and compete with Hemingway because he just couldn't. And a lot of people say that The Great Gatsby is really a bad Hemingway novel, and that's actually an interesting way to look at it, because you can easily see how Hemingway's style severely influenced, almost to a crippling extent, F. Scott Fitzgerald writing, at least to my eyes. So Hemingway is the major writer, and yet today he is ignored. Today, people copy his prose style, the iceberg theory. They copy it unawares because people think that it comes from Raymond Carver. Raymond Carver, of course, the short story writer of the 70s and 80s, who wrote collections such as Where I'm Calling From. I'm assuming you all know who Raymond Carver is. Now, Raymond Carver, had this very clean style, but if you look at it and you compare it to Hemingway, you're like, it's just a cheap Hemingway knockoff, right? The only difference, of course, is that Carver was writing about drunks and about people who had allowed their emotional lives to overrun them and to dominate them. And that's the difference, because you see, Hemingway deliberately feels that a man must control his emotions, that a man who has lost control of his emotions becomes a coward. Because to Hemingway, it's not that a coward is somebody who runs away from danger. Rather, a coward is one who allows his emotions, his animal instincts, to overwhelm him and dominate his life, dominate his attention, dominate the things that he does with his life and the actions that he carries out. That is why Hemingway has this thing about hating cowardiceness. It's not that he's like a super macho guy. It's rather he identifies cowardiceness with a lack of emotional control, which he believes, at least implicitly in his work, the lack of emotional control was what led to chaos, both personal chaos and social chaos, and led to war, which is what he had experienced and which had traumatized him so much. Okay, I've gone on for a while. I've ranted for a while. I hope that's been illuminating.
No, yeah, I honestly think it's a good setup of the story that I think one of the stories, or at least we're primarily concerned with dealing with this short, happy life of Francis McAmor, is particularly what caught my interest is as you're talking about Hemingway's perspective on what the control, at least the male control of emotions and means in terms of, keeping, some sense in order to this realm of chaos. That is fundamentally the kind of issue we're dealing with in this story in a very direct kind of way. And I had thought to myself as I was reading the story, and we'll probably go into a sort of high level summary in a minute, that there was one character in the story who I thought, this feels like the Hemingway character to me, namely the white hunter in here. That's the ideal Hemingway type. But as you described through the biography of Hemingway wanting to overcome his neuroses and find that courage within himself, like, oh shit, there's more of Hemingway in the McAmor character than perhaps in the white hunter. I mean, I'm sure it's in both. But,
before we get into McAmor, which was the story that you picked, and which is the one that you want to talk about?
It's a very short one. It's literally 4 pages long. It's Hills Like White Elephants. Now, Hills Like White Elephants, I'll just do the quick summary of that one. It's a dialogue piece, and the way I kind of think about it it's a pencil sketch advanced draft of Waiting for Godot if it was a story about a man and a woman. Mm-hmm. That is a story where literally there's a man and a woman waiting. It seems like they're waiting for a train in I believe it's a Spanish environment, and it is Spain, yeah. And they're talking about the woman's talking about potentially getting a procedure. She's unsure if she wants to do it. The husband saying, you should do it if you want to. And they're going back and forth at what this means. The procedure is an abortion. It's never said explicitly, but it's heavily implied. And I think you'd be foolish not to come to that conclusion that that's the procedure being discussed.
Unquestionably. You do keep in mind that at that time there was a certain censorship rules, and so certain events could not be articulated clearly. For instance, you couldn't say the word "fuck" in mainstream literature at that time. But certainly, an abortion would be a topic that would get you censored for bad taste. I forget the name of it. And so yeah, they're talking about abortion. If they don't mention it explicitly, it's because of that rule. But there's no question that that's what they're referring to.
And what's interesting about it, even though it's a back and forth dialogue and written in such a way as, like I said, there's minimal description per se in the underlying mental motivation of either character. You're left to try to come to the conclusion of who really wants the procedure, whether this couple's, in truly has any emotional bonds left in them, and what's the real goal of what they're trying to get out of with this procedure, if in fact that is what they want.
Let me just show this to the audience. I don't know if you guys can see it. I hope that you can. This is the second, third page of the story. And as you can see, it's all dialogue play. Forgive me there, but I assure you, there's, as far as I can see in the second and third pages, there is no description whatsoever. Just to show you, there's a chunk at the start of the book, of the story rather, here, where they talk about basically a setting, and then they just dive into it. A second paragraph of light description, and then it just goes on dialogue all the way. And let me just show you the last couple of pages. It's all dialogue except the final paragraph of description. Now, and if you look at the actual dialogue, it's incredibly curt and to the point, and at the same time, it's rather mundane. Because that's another thing that Hemingway pioneered, the use of mundane language in dialogue. Because before Hemingway, people would say things when they talked. They wouldn't say the mundane. They wouldn't say, "Oh, pass the salt." Yeah. But Hemingway started using that. But of course, in service of this notion of his iceberg theory that the mundanity and the trivialness of dialogue was actually referencing something much more profound. How does this work in Hills Like White Elephants? I'm asking you, Dr. Benway.
Well, because what's interesting about, talking about the mundane, it's part of the idea, especially with I think the iceberg theory, as you described, is best almost exhibited in this story, from my opinion, is because you're trying to deal with the great unanswered issue or problem at the core of this marriage or maybe it's not a marriage, it's just a relationship that neither are able to talk about directly. Talking about it directly is either too painful, too powerful, or too extreme for them to kind of deal with. So they have to talk around it. And even the act of the abortion itself isn't really the issue per se. I mean, it is, but it isn't. Fundamentally, what's going on at this story is there any spark of vitality left in this relationship, under the presumption that, if you kill off what this relationship, or what all relationships in some sense are fundamentally aiming to do, namely to create life and continue, the existence of humanity, what's left? They're just going around looking for baubles and little fun, excursions to this, that, or the other. Can they maintain any kind of real passion for one another if they really don't have a purpose of being together other than just going places and probably occasionally fucking? That's the issue. But neither are, perhaps courageous is the wrong word, but I'll go with it. Neither are courageous enough to deal with it directly.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually very interesting, because it would show that a lot of times courage, insofar as other aspects of your life, is not demonstrated in the intimate ones, and often is not the intimate moments are the ones that require the most courage. For instance, in the case of this couple, they both lack the courage to say, to call it a day, to call it quits, and to go through with the procedure and end their relationship and go their separate ways. They neither of them have the courage for that.
There's a way in that story that the man is describing his attitude towards whether the female character should or should not get the abortion. And it's a line I think a lot of men have either said or thought about saying, which was, you should only get it if you really want to, and I want you to do what you want to do. That's as big a cop-out line as you conceivably get, because you're taking no responsibility one way or the other. You're saying,
I'll support you in whatever you do.
I'll support you, whatever. It's like, I have a feeling a few guys have been in this spot, particularly about this procedure or anything like it.
Few?
A few, shall we say? I won't name names, but
No, don't look at me. Don't look at me.
I'm definitely not necessarily looking at you. But yeah, I mean, it's this idea like he can't, even in the act of saying, the abortion, I can't tell you to get it whether or not it's the same. This is the same kind of attitude underlying it. You would say this is the same kind of man who just can't say it's over or it's not over. Right. The abortion is kind of a playing field for that inaction to take place as well.
Yeah. Well, I think in all of these stories that you have, I mean, Hemingway, he is showing individuals confronting their fears and either failing to live up to their own standards or succeeding. Now, the story that I want to talk about is, of course, The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, which is, it's a devastating story. Because what it is basically the story of a hunter called Francis Macomber who goes off to Africa. He's a rich man, and he goes with his wife and a guide,
I think he's called a white hunter. Yeah, white hunter. Yeah,
and he goes with them out on safari, and it's a well-equipped, well-stocked safari with tents and servants and good food and all the rest of it. I mean, nothing like a real hiking trip, or it's the rich man's little holiday. And the story opens with Francis Macomber, who has he lost his nerve and failed to kill a leopard or an elephant? A lion, right. And what happened was that everybody knows that he's a coward, and he is trying to get over this fact. Now his wife is essentially cheating on him with the white hunter. His wife, he's been married to her for 10 years, and they are childless, which there's the intimation that this is significant, that their relationship in a very real sense has become purely transactional, and that there's no purpose to it, which would make sense because a man like Hemingway would see that a relationship is to procreate. In and of itself, it's pointless. The White Hills of Africa sort of like proves that point, because the characters in that story are basically realizing that the relationship is over, and therefore they should abort this child as they would abort the relationship, because there's no future in it. Right? So anyway, the relationship that Francis Macomber has with his wife, she is cucking him literally, and it's told from the point of view of the white hunter. And what's interesting is that the white hunter feels contempt and pity for Francis Macomber, and eventually it transpires that Francis Macomber realizes that he has to abandon his wife, and he winds up killing the a lion, another lion, I believe. And as he shoots at this charging lion and dominates his own fear of losing his marriage, his own fear of the lion, his wife kills him, shoots him with a shotgun of her own. And she gets very hysterical and all the rest of it, and the white hunter leads the reader to understand that it will all be explained away as an accident. But he knows for a fact that it wasn't an accident. She deliberately killed him. And or at least that's my interpretation of it.
I'll clarify a few points, because I know you had mentioned it. It has been a little bit a while since you read the story, so there's a couple of details I want to tweak that actually make your overall rating even better. If I just tweak one. The story is sort of written in the omniscient third person. I say sort of because it's actually this is a very interesting technique you got here, which is, yes, you have this almost omniscient narrator who goes into Macomber's mind. He goes into Wilson's mind. He even kind of goes into the lion's mind, but there's one mind he doesn't really go into, and that's the wife. And I think that's somewhat intentional, because her motivations are inferred from the thoughts of the men around her, which is significant because it actually plays into the ending of her motivation. Though I agree with you, I think that the motivation you laid out is probably the one that's there. The other interesting thing is the attitude of Wilson to Macomber, and I do think he does pity Macomber. He recognizes that this act of cowardice and just to be give Macomber a little bit of empathy or sympathy. In the first safari they go after the lion, Macomber does manage to wound the lion, and the lion runs off into the bush. And in order to get this lion out, they have to kind of run into the bush to kind of ferret him out, or at least tempt him out. And I'll tell you this: a wounded lion and Hemingway paints it almost like a man with rage in his heart, the lion's heart, for being wounded, mortally wounded, and he's ready to take a guy out. I mean, like, you have every reason to be scared shitless of this thing. This thing, a caged animal is going to, if he wants to kill you, he's going to take this shot. Now, and this is the difference between Wilson and McNamara. Is McNamara does lose his nerve and just literally runs the fuck out of there, as quite frankly, probably a lot of us would do. I think a lot of us don't have the nerve, but Wilson understands there is fear here. In fact, there's a passage in the story. They said the old Swahili native said, you get scared. A brave man feels fear in the face of a lion 3 times: when he hears him move, when he makes the first roar, and when he sees the lion. In other words, the fear is the natural part, the necessary factor of bravery. The bravery, to your point, and what Wilson manifests is, I feel this fear, and I'm not going to show it, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to, take charge anyway. But the fact that McNamara reveals his cowardice to his wife breaks the illusion they've been living with. And there's a really interesting passage that's describing this illusion they have, which, yeah, you're absolutely right. She's probably been cucking him around. But there's, in Europe in particular, which I think McNamara's English, they're able to kind of just deal with this fiction for a variety of reasons. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs if you guys don't mind me doing this.
By all means.
His wife had been...
Tell us, just so in case anybody's...
Okay, so I'm reading the edition, the Finca Virga edition.
Everybody has a different edition.
Okay, sure. So it's in the story. It's right after...
More like halfway through, or...
Yeah, it's page 18 out of 29 or 28 in mine, so about a little bit past halfway through. It's after describing the lion event and his cowardice and Wilson and everything. And so it starts, it's descriptive paragraphs. So I'll start. His wife had been through with him before, but it never lasted. He was very wealthy and would be much wealthier, and he knew she would not leave him ever now. They were one of the few things he really knew. He knew about that, about motorcycles, that was earliest, about motor cars, about duck shooting, about fishing, trout, salmon, the big sea, about sex and books, many books, too many books, about all court games, about dogs, not much about horses, about hanging on to his money, and most of the other things he would deal in, about his wife not leaving him. His wife had been a great beauty, and she was still a great beauty in Africa, but she was not a great enough beauty anymore at home to be able to leave him and better herself, and she knew it, and he knew it. She had missed the chance to leave him, and he knew it. If he had been better with women, she would probably have started to worry about him getting any other new beautiful wife, but she knew too much about him to worry about him either. Also, he had always had a great tolerance, which seemed the nicest thing about him, if it were not the most sinister. And in all they were known as comparatively happy married couple, one of those whose disruption is often rumored but never occurs. And as the Society columnists put it, they were adding more than a spice of adventure to their much envied and ever-enduring romance by a safari in what was known as darkest Africa, until the Martin Johnsons lighted it on so many silver screens where they were pursuing old Simba the lion, the buffalo, Tembo, the elephant, and as well as collecting specimens for the Museum of Natural History. The same colonists had reported on them on the verge at least 3 times in the past, and they had been. But they had always made it up. They always had a sound basis of union. Margot was too beautiful for Macomber to divorce her, and Macomber had too much money for Margot to ever leave him. Now that's a fiction which we can envision, like it's just a marriage of convenience through and through. But in this particular realm of Africa, and I may want to come back to this later because Africa as a psychological place in literature is very interesting to me. In this area where people become a little bit closer to their quote unquote natural animal instincts, in this act of cowardice, the facade that this relationship has used to maintain itself can no longer be maintained because the cowardice was revealed to itself amongst enough of a group of people to where, I guess, you're going to have to interpret what Mrs. Macomber is thinking is like, I can't keep up the civility anymore or the farce anymore. And she runs off to fuck Wilson. And Wilson's attitude towards all this is kind of interesting. He's like, it's not my responsibility to not fuck your wife, so I'm going to, which was really fun, a really funny moment.
Yeah, that's actually, which is a true response, because it's not his responsibility. I mean, it's his wife. He's just a random dude passing along. I mean, so it's sort of like, if you see if you drop £100 note on the street, right, or $100 note on the street, and I pick it up, how come it's my fault? You were the one who was supposed to take care of it, right? So it makes sense.
The other funny thing was, there's passages in there where Wilson sees through Mrs. McLemore faster than anybody else in this story. Like, he knows I think he even uses the phrase, she's no good, or she's a bitch, or I think he refers to McLemore as a 4-letter word, which you're supposed to, I think, interpret as cuck. And her as a 5-letter word, which you'll interpret as bitch, but they do say bitch at the end. And there's a great passage of, what is the offspring of a 4-letter word man and a 5-letter word woman? And what does that potentially mean? What does that mean? But needless to say, Wilson, like I said, Wilson's attitude towards McLemore develops as the story goes, because the next day after the hunt, after McLemore's wife fucks Wilson, and there's a great dialogue burst of emotion, the three getting pissed off at each other. They go on the second leg of the hunt, and this time, rather than another lion, which I think was probably they're hunting buffalo or water buffalo. And Wilson gets very aggressive and actually does very well. He kills, or at least he is thought to kill, the lead buffalo and severely wounds the other two, and Wilson helps him out. But Wilson says, in that moment, you could see there was a change to the guy. He took back his courage amidst this cuckolding, amidst this fear of the last day. And there's an energy in him that Wilson really respects. He says, I can see this guy overcoming the problems and the cowardice I saw before. But simultaneously, his wife is more and more distraught over this. And one of the interpretations I had read about this story, which I think was very interesting, is like, is this a question about the power play in the relationship? And you get some passages in the earlier dialogue where you think this might be the case, where Mrs. McLemore realizes that, just given the situation, she has a lot of sway and power in this relationship. Not only can she go and fuck who she wants, she can basically get McLemore to do what she wants in some regard. He can't even keep her from going on the hunt. But in this act of, recapturing his aggressive courage and finding confidence in himself, she becomes very wary. She's like, am I losing in this relationship here? And this is in her mind, or at least she implied that this is in her mind, and her anxiety, which is physically manifest, because that's how we suspect what's in her mind, goes on as they continue on this hunt of the buffalo. And apparently, similar situation, the lead buffalo is heavily wounded but not dead, and McLemore and Wilson have to go ferret it out. And there's an interesting detail he said, which was because the buffalo, I don't know if you've ever seen these African buffalo, the horns they have, it's almost like a thick tuft of hair. And Wilson says, look, you can't shoot it in the head like you would normally to take it down, because that horn matter is so thick that the bullet won't do anything. You got to shoot it in the face. And, McLemore tends to shoot high, or miss high, it says in the book. So as this thing is charging at him and getting closer, he keeps missing and missing. And the defining moment is when his wife, pulls a gun out from the car that she's in and shoots as well, but she hits her husband in the back of the skull or something, and he dies. And and that's where the ending ambiguous situation is. What was her goal there? And again, I want to read the ending, if you don't mind, of that, because it's just a beautiful passage of kind of like knowingness. And this is after okay, so McLemore's shot. Wilson, tells the gun holder attendees to cover him up and get word to whomever, and he goes, this will be the last of the story on the last page. Wilson stood up and saw the buffalo on his side, his legs out, his thinly haired belly crawling with ticks. Hell of a good bull, his brain registered automatically. A good 50 inches or better. He called to the driver and told him to spread a blanket over the body and stay by it. Then he walked over to the motor car where the woman sat crying in the corner. That was a pretty thing to do, he said in a toneless voice. He would have left you, too. Stop it, she said. Of course it's an accident, he said. I know that. Stop it, she said. Don't worry, he said. There will be a certain amount of unpleasantness, but I'll have some photographs taken, and they'll be very useful at the inquest. There's the testimony of gun bearers and the driver, too. You're perfectly all right. Stop it, she said. There's a hell of a lot to be done, he said, and I'll have to send a truck off to the lake to wireless for a plane to take the 3 of us into Nairobi. Why didn't you poison him? That's what they do in England. Stop it, stop it, stop it, the woman cried. Wilson looked at her with his flat blue eyes. I'm through now, he said. I was a little angry. I'd begun to like your husband. Oh, please stop it, she said. Please stop it. That's better, Wilson said. Please is much better. Now I'll stop. That's a fucking
Heavy
ending.
shit. Hang on a second. Let me just refresh the conversation because you keep cutting out. Hang on. Hello, you hear me good?
Yeah, I hear you.
Oh, and audience members, could you do me a big favor? Could you just hit 1 to tell me that you guys are hearing me all right and hearing Dr. Benway all right?
Test dialogue, just in case you can hear me.
Yeah.
Again, hopefully you can see why I love this story.
Yeah. And thank you very much. Great. And Benway, why don't you refresh your thing too? And just refresh the page of the Hangout because you kept dropping out the whole time, and it was really annoying.
All right, sorry. Let me try to do this again.
And thank you guys. I see all of your ones here. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. I hope you guys, by the way, while we wait for Dr. Benway to come back, I hope you guys are enjoying this conversation.
Hello, I'm back. Do I come across a little better this time?
Yeah, you do. You do. Now, just for the peanut gallery, we're going to do like some quickie YouTube drama. Dr. Benway, I heard that your avatar is often fucking like somebody else. Are you happy that your avatar is cucking you?
My avatar,
because it seems,
me.
frankly, that everybody's like doing like fucking drama, and it's just so tedious. I much prefer to be doing like dorky shit like this than to be doing drama, to tell you the truth. And I hope the audience is on the same page. If you're on the same page, if you prefer dorkiness to drama, just type dorkiness on your comments, because for me, I'm just a lot happier having this kind of a conversation. So anyway, Dr. Benway, you were talking clearly. The Macklemore story hit you harder than it hit me. So you run with it. You tell us what you're thinking.
Like I said, what's interesting to me is I was going under the impression, especially early on in the story, that I thought, Macklemore, because I know the basic premise of the story, and I thought Macklemore was going to be portrayed in the most unsympathetic way. I mean, as far as, today's era is concerned with, I think, the right-wing YouTube folk, the cuck is probably as a big a kiss of death as you could give in many ways. I mean, intellectually cucking is probably worse than actual cucking, though actual cucking is certainly nothing to be proud of. But what's interesting in the story is, even amidst this situation of, I've been exposed as a, weakling man, in the face of that death, it's because it is a kind of death, to still, in some sense, rescue your courage or find your courage from that and find a life in that moment, even if that moment is a flittering few minutes before your wife shoots you in the back of the head. That is there's some value to that. There's truth to that. I don't think this is the short, happy life of Francis Macklemore by accident. I think the short, happy life was those few minutes.
Yes. Well, here's my thinking, and this ties into something I said about Solzhenitsyn, or let me rephrase that, something Solzhenitsyn had said, and one of the reasons I respect him so much. Solzhenitsyn, as I always quote, said that the line dividing good from evil does not separate people, but rather it runs through the middle of every man's heart. There's both a capacity for great good and great evil in each man's heart. And the struggle that we have is of trying to stay on the right side of that line. And so by the same token, you can think that the struggle to be a man, who faces his fear and controls and dominates his own fear and moves forward and acts as he should. That's the same thing. It's the same choice, the choice between righteousness and evil. Because in a weird way, throughout the writing of Hemingway, you tend to start to see cowardice as a form of evil, as something pernicious that can pull you down. And the fact that Macomber overcomes his fear, and does lead a fulfilling life, if only for those few short minutes. That's a moment of grace for him. It's a weird thing. Go ahead.
And it was also in that moment of grace that it kind of turns. And like I said, it's interesting that Hemingway, even in this omniscient narrator position, chose not to go into the mental thinking of Mrs. Macomber, I think very usefully in the story, allows an interesting moment, at least for me. I don't know if you felt it. When Macomber goes through this state of grace of finding his courage, and you see the end results of his wife and what she's done to him, your perspective on him switches a little bit. I think before you'd think of, you know what, can't blame his wife for cucking around on this guy. There's no confidence there. There's a sham to this relationship anyway. She's going to run off and do her own thing. Yeah, you can dislike her for not being loyal, but what was she going to be loyal to? But her cruelty, and I think it is a cruelty, and it's not just in the moment that she shoots him, although that crystallizes it. You see it by virtue of the fact that this finding of courage in shooting a buffalo is so important to him that you begin to wonder, and her reaction to it immediately is so dramatic that you wonder to him, it's like, who was really stepping on who in this relationship? Who was really, as it were, being the force to subdue the vitality of whom in this relationship? I have a strong feeling that, again, just given the nature of how this story ends, this was also a guy being stepped on as much as he was just in no position to be a quote unquote man in this situation.
Well, what's interesting is that, okay, let's ignore the stylistic element for a bit and focus on the thematic aspect. If you think about it, from the point of view of the woman, the fact that he was a coward was an affront to her. It seems to be clear that he had been like a coward and so easily manipulated by her for so long that she felt it as a lack of respect towards her. And that's sort of like my interpretation of it. And the fact that he finally, had the balls to stand up was actually different in the sense of now that he had courage, now that he was going to be courageous, he would potentially drop her because she had been an awful wife to him. But she had been an awful wife to him because she felt that his cowardiceness was an affront to her. So it's a very interesting sort of like ping-ponging between the two. Also, it's sort of like, and this you can understand why SJWs and feminists would hate this story with a passion, because the man is by overcoming his fear, he's going to drop his wife, as Wilson says at the end. He was definitely going to drop her, and the three of them knew it. Perhaps they hadn't articulated yet, or he didn't have it clear in their minds, but he was going to drop her, and it was that. The fact that that she no longer had any sway over him, that required him to kill him, and in a weird sense, it's sort of like almost like a metaphor for feminism. Think about it. The feminism hates and wants to destroy that which cannot be controlled by feminism. You see what I'm saying? What do you think of that interpretation? It's just an idea.
That's an interesting one. I slightly different, but I think maybe related. I think one of the reasons, because I was thinking about this, because they said it in a number of his stories, like, is Hemingway a misogynist? Because he has, shall we say, an aggressive attitude toward women. I wouldn't say unsympathetic, because I think that's misreading his writing. But what gets to it is like, and I read it in this story, and I read it in a few other places. I don't think Hemingway would ever walk away saying a woman is powerless what he would say was that there's masculine power and then there's feminine power. And, there's a way that women know how to use the power that's imbued with them by their own natural womanhood. What I think the quote unquote feminists, ironically enough, of today would hate, and maybe it's more the SJWs, is the fact that this power is gendered and based on the biology of the people wielding it, that they are frustrated. They would prefer an androgynous power, which is just, for its own sake, and Hemingway doesn't have that, because Hemingway is observing the reality of men and women.
Yeah, exactly. Because a feminist would have written this story as like they're basically like, the wife is basically a butch, right? And she just carries her shotgun and shoots elephants just like him, and she shoots him. It would be a Mary Sue story, right? And but feminism and the way that SJWs want their art to be would have denied the complexity of the relationship. Because here's the interesting thing, and why I think it's stupid to label Hemingway a misogynist. He understands the true power of women. He understands them exceptionally well. And he understands the dynamic between men and women, and how a woman, a helpless quote unquote woman, can have enormous power in the relationship, the dominant power in the relationship, because that's what's happening in Frances Macomber's marriage. And it's the fact that she has the dominant power that makes her despise him. And that's something that feminists constantly crash into, because they can't accept that a woman wants to be overwhelmed and dominated.
I think it's no surprise that night that Macomber ran from the lion was the night she chose to go to the man who didn't run, namely Wilson.
Oh.
And she has confidence as well when her husband confronts her that night. He says, "Where were you?" And she's like, "Oh, I was just taking a breath of fresh air." He says, "Oh, is that what you call it now, you fucking bitch?" It's great, great. And that's what's also interesting to me is, like, I think, and I could be wrong, because there's, as per usual, there's a lot of books at this time I haven't read, but I feel like this story, the sharpness and the anger in the dialogue between Macomber and his wife, and Macomber and Wilson, and the aggressiveness and the just blunt language must have been fresh, very fresh at the time. I just, obviously you had mentioned, like, you're not going to get shit like that out of Henry James. You certainly are.
Oh, certainly not.
Side note, there's a
Charles for that matter. He was too polite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hence why, that's why I brought up when I was a kid, I did hear this phrase, the red-faced authors and the pale-faced authors.
Let me ask you something. As somebody who's read a lot of contemporary fiction, how did stylistically, let's set aside a little bit the themes, because I'm interested in the themes, but I want to take a little break and talk about the style. And then return to the themes, because I think we've touched on them a little bit, and the style is of great interest to me. So I want to hear your first opinion, because you'd never read this story before, had you?
No, I hadn't.
And so, what was your vibe, your feeling as you read it? Did it read dusty to you? Fresh, intermediate? You tell me.
It's a little bit complicated, but hopefully interesting as I'll answer it. It felt with a rich sense of vitality. It felt more contemporary to me than its time, but I wouldn't say it felt absolutely to the minute contemporary. It felt contemporary to me as good writing would have been, let's say, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. The reason I say that is because I think the style I encounter now is a style which I think, consciously or not, feels like it's replaced minimalism, or at least that, direct pounding boom 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 of the writing, which is it's basically this self introspection novel, which is heavily, as I read it in contemporary literature, is based on really digging deep into, like, I think I told you this before, the artist as, oh, I'm alone in New York and no one understands me, and why does my MFA not give me all the friends I could ever want, and this, that, the other, that self-absorbed writing, which is so solipsistic that it's locked in the mind of the writer. Whereas the writer, Hemingway, as you said, the writer has disappeared, even though he's on every single page and whatnot. Hemingway isn't sitting in a room saying, why don't people understand that I'm an older guy now and nobody likes me and I'm going to go off to Ketchum, Idaho and shoot myself in the fucking face, attitude. That is not the story that we're dealt with.
So you're basically saying that he's not a pussy.
He's not a pussy. Yes, it's true. But but in addition, I really want to stress he's not self-absorbed in a weird way. Even though, as you had mentioned, the biography, he's in some sense metaphorically and symbolically painting his biography in this trip to Africa through these characters. But it's not nowhere in the story do you hear Hemingway say, "That's me, that's me. You should like this guy, you should dislike that guy, and for these very specific reasons." He's painting the story in such a way that you're probably going to lean one way or another on that interpretation. But there's a vigor to this story which I've missed in contemporary fiction. Probably why I don't read much.
Now you noticed something. You noticed something before that you mentioned about the style, and you were struck by the fact that he nonchalantly and without a big to-do about it would enter into the minds of all of his characters, even the lion at one point. You expand on that a little bit. Why were you surprised, or why were you struck by that?
Well, I was specifically struck by what's the best way to put it? The areas where he chose to do it and when he chose not to do it. So this is, I think, who's the good New Yorker critic? James Wood, I think, has talked about this, which talks about like the semi-omniscient, semi-subjective third person. Right. What do I mean by that? So with an omniscient narrator, you have the opportunity to literally, to use the omniscience to its full definition of the term and be aware of literally everything, the motivations, the specific psychological attitudes of every last character. You're not necessarily one subjective viewer who's sort of locked in himself and trying to interpret. You have access to whatever you want. And what's interesting in this is when you choose not to use it for the wife, Mrs. McLemore, you create a situation where, yes, you have this objective narrator, but it's not God. God would have known what's in her mind. You have a narrator who's, almost like the narrator, even though it's an omniscient third person, is a man, it feels like to me. And that man can know the minds of his fellow men, even the mind of a male lion in such a way, but he has to interpret and get around what the female mind is saying and what is intuiting from there. So, to me, that does that in some sense make this a truly male story or meant for males? Like, look, we know how other men are going to think, but we can only intuit or try to come to some conclusion of how the woman is going to think through her actions. And that to me creates an interesting dynamic in the richness of the story. Like at the ending, do we know if Mrs. McLemore really did it by accident, or was she, intentionally just wanted to kill her husband so she could free herself of the situation and get his money? That ambiguity is a necessary part of the story to me.
Well, I disagree. I actually, I don't see there being any kind of ambiguity to the end. I mean, do you?
Well, I interpreted a very, I think, you're going to lead it to a very specific way, but you're never going to have the absolute certainty. The absolute certainty of why she did what she did is, you get it through her actions. You have absolute certainty as a man knowing how the world is going to work in this situation, but you don't have it from God telling you this is how it is.
Well, okay. Well, anyway, the point I wanted to make about the style, which I find, by the way, sorry, you hearing me properly, Dr. Benway?
I'm hearing you now, but you're a little bit out of sync video-wise, but that's probably not a big deal.
No big deal. In real life, I'm out of sync between my video and my audio, so Anyway, no, seriously. What I find fascinating about the style that I find really interesting is I was trying to get it now on the screen, and I'll get it later. There's a story. Let me just try to find this damn thing called "Nick Sat Against the Wall," where it's one of the early stories that Hemingway wrote. Okay, and in this early story, it actually appeared in his very first collection. He doesn't have any kind of indication of what is going on insofar as oh geez, where'd it go? There's no, how can I put this? Okay, let me just stop trying to find the story, which I should have done before, and it was my lack of preparation, and I beg you all to accept my apologies. And let me just get to the point. In his early stories, Hemingway would very self-consciously, because he was a newspaper man, refrain from trying to explain any kind of motivation or any kind of internal dialogue or internal emotion that the characters were experiencing. In his early stories, he focused strictly on their actions. I mentioned before how he would eliminate all adjectives and every adverb. I mean, adverbs were verboten as far as Hemingway was concerned, especially early on. But the thing was that, see, his early style, which was totally superficial, not in the sense of a superficial in a trivial sense, but rather focusing on the surface of things and the actual events, as opposed to trying to get below the surface and try to actually access the motivation and the internal feelings and thoughts of the characters. Well, this facial style that he had in the development of his style, it was all surface. But then during the 30s, and as he wrote his novels, which we're going to get into in just a little bit, as he wrote his novels, he started getting more and more into the motivation of his characters, because it seems to me as a reader and as a fellow author that he saw that from external cues, a fairly capable individual would understand the motivation and thoughts of what was going on with the characters. So why not just dive into it? Here's something also that's very interesting. Hemingway was heavily influenced by Constance Garnett's translations of Tolstoy, especially Anna Karenina. Now, why does this matter? Well, first of all, Tolstoy was a great author, but also Constance Garnett's translations were very specific. They were very workmanlike. I think that would be a charitable way of putting it. And because of this, because he was influenced by specifically Constance Garnett's translations of Tolstoy. See, Tolstoy had this ability that he would effortlessly go into the minds of the various characters. There's one famous in Anna Karenina, I think, that he just dives into the consciousness of a dog. You know, he just like dives into it and then dives right out, because, you know, Tolstoy, very self-consciously, posited himself as the god of his characters, of the god of his literary universe, which is one way to be an author, right? And very egomaniacal, I suppose, but pretty cool, because, you know, you can do anything. You really are omniscient because you're the god of your characters. And what's interesting in the Francis Macomber story is that Hemingway is sort of like reaching for that ideal, which interestingly would be fully expressed in his last major work, which was The Old Man and the Sea. If you go to the early novels, they tend to be all surface. He doesn't dive into the motivation or the internal thinking of the character. And even though, and this is worth noting, even though at this time, in the early 1920s, James Joyce had already published Ulysses, which famously has the stream of consciousness technique, which was applied infamously or famously in the last chapter with Molly Bloom, the Molly Bloom chapter of Ulysses, right? Which is all stream of consciousness. Hemingway was intimately familiar with Ulysses and Joyce's work. He was friends with Joyce, and they went out drinking together. And so he would know about the style, and yet deliberately he refrained from it. And it was only as he grew older that he started, you know, feeling the sense that he could go into the motivations of character. Okay. Now, I personally think that, you know, in Macomber and his later stories and his later, you know, Old Man and the Sea, his ability to dive into the consciousness of his characters shows a self-confidence in what he's trying to say. Because you're right, when he chooses to dive into his character's consciousness, reveals something of what he is intending as an artist, what he is intending us to perceive in his story. If he dives into the consciousness at this moment, not this other moment, right? To this and not to that over there. How could I put it? Okay, that decision of like pay attention to this but not to that. That reveals a self-confidence in contemporary authors, because a lot of contemporary authors decide, oh no, I'm not going to get into the consciousness of anybody. You know, a lot of these MFA students, right, who don't know shit about just step away and don't dive into their characters because they're afraid. They don't believe in the power of empathy, is what I'm in a very long-winded way trying to say. Contemporary authors do not believe in empathy, in the ability to understand the motivation and thinking of something else, of somebody else. Whereas Hemingway implicitly does. He implicitly grants all of his characters a humanity which contemporary authors, especially young authors, seem to be afraid of indulging, afraid of granting the character a humanity that they themselves possess as authors.
Well,
does this make any sense to you?
It does, and my take on it is maybe a little different, but I think it's in line with yours. So first off, you were breaking up a little bit when you were talking, so am I coming through okay right now?
Yeah, you're coming out great.
Okay, perfect. So my take, I think there is fear, and I think that fear is very specific, and what it is I think related to the condition of the age and condition of going through an MFA program in the SJW world. And I, that sounds like a cop-out, but it's not, because what it means is the fear of going into another's mind who is not yours. You immediately go into this, so like, oh, am I appropriating another person's consciousness who I don't know, particularly if that person is not of your type? If I write about a woman in a way that I think an actual woman would talk, am I just perpetuating this stereotype versus that stereotype? That's the fear. The fear is would be the constant accusation that you, as a person in the world who can feel and empathize with other people, are in fact projecting on other people some sort of patriarchal or racist system. And by virtue of that, you create the situation where you are locked into your own world, a world where if you write about yourself and you're a white person, oh, you're just, a white privileged son of a bitch who doesn't reflect the realities of the world. If you're a white person who writes about non-white people in your stories and have empathy with them, fuck you, you're a racist appropriator. So what are you left with? You are left with very solipsistic stories, if indeed that's in fact what you want to do with your life as a writer. And I know people who really write, who feel like the compulsion, all they can do is write because they have to get it out, and who are genuine and want to write about the other people. You'll never see these stories outside of small presses, self-publication, little magazines, what have you, because the contemporary, and this is why I said Hemingway's story felt vital to me and fresh, but not truly contemporary, because the contemporary milieu would not allow that style of writing that he had.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, in my own experience, I've been doxxed. I'm not going to mention my actual name because I've made a policy not to do it, but I used to be an author and I did other things. I mean, I published a few novels and then went off and did other things. And then in 2014, I wanted to sort of like get back in the game of publishing, 2014 and 15. And the publishing world had left me behind because it's become so solipsistic and so locked in that any kind of fiction that is outside of that norm is just anathema. And also, just so that you have to keep in mind why this has happened. It is actually because of the lack of diversity. And let me explain. In the big 5 publishers in New York, you see, it is dominated by white Jewish women who are of an upper middle class, or if not upper class, socioeconomically speaking. They dominate it. It's like there are only these white Jewish women who were basically born and raised in Manhattan, or who were taught from an early age that Manhattan is where they want to live and where they want to have their lives, right? And these women are married to lawyers and Manhattan lawyers or Manhattan doctors or hedge fund managers or what have you, and they're of a type. Now, the reason why it's dominated by this particular demographic is very simple. Because you see, in order to get a job in a publishing house, you have to, a entry-level job, you have to have had some sort of internship. And these internships are unpaid. These unpaid internships, well, who can have an unpaid internship in Manhattan? Manhattan, one of the most expensive cities in the world. Obviously, only somebody who has, parents who can afford to fork over, $5,000 a month, so that little Bitsy can, work at a publishing house in an unpaid internship and get the contacts, so that later when she graduates from college, she'll get an entry-level position as an assistant to an editor or something like that. And that assistant to an editor position is also, it pays peanuts. It pays, after taxes, maybe, $2,000, which $2,000 in New York is nothing. You can't live on $2,000 in New York. And so only people from upper middle class and upper class backgrounds, where the parents can afford to foot the bill for the little Bitsy's first few years of her career in publishing, those are the people who can get into publishing and later succeed in publishing. You see? And so that's why you have this particular demographic.
Funny enough, slight tangent, but it's useful as if this is an exercise in recommending things for people to watch and read. The movie I'd recommend people watch, because it does capture this in a very direct way, although it's from the 1980s, so there's a little bit things that are different, is from Whit Stillman's trilogy on the doomed bourgeoisies, The Last Days of Disco. The main characters are all upper middle class, if not upper class women who are in these internships / entry jobs in Manhattan. They're living together, but they're heavily subsidized, and they're in many ways looking for wealthy men to be wed to. Again, a little bit of a tangent, but it gives you a nice, rich milieu of what's going on here.
That's exactly it. I mean, no, it's not a tangent. You're right on the money. Whit Stillman had an eye for that kind of character. The Last Days of Disco, and also Metropolitan to a lesser extent. Metropolitan is really about New York society in the late 70s, early 80s, right? But The Last Days of Disco, I was living in Manhattan when that movie came out, and it was right on the money. It was right on the money. That was it, and it's gotten worse, okay? So anyway, these women who are now editors of these big publishing houses, a kind of fiction that Hemingway was writing, they would have been horrified by it. They would have been horrified. I mean, they would run from it. They despise this because, in a very real sense, these women, think about it, they are basically Macomer's wife. That's who they are. They are Macomer's wife, and they are afraid of masculine strength. They are deathly afraid of masculine strength, and this is why I want to return a little bit to the story here, because it seems to me, and you tell me what's going on, that Macomer's wife, in a very real sense, both despises the weakness of her husband and yet wants him to be strong, wants him to be a man, and yet at the same time is deathly afraid of him actually becoming a man, not because necessarily she will lose her position, but because she will be dominated by Macomer. And she doesn't want that, and yet she needs it. It seems to me that the story very clearly encapsulates this incredible dilemma that Mrs. Macomer has. What do you think?
I think that's spot on. I mean, Margot, I think her name is. I mean, that's absolutely it. I mean, if there's one thing I've observed in my 30 some odd years of long life compared to many YouTube viewers, is that, people are operating, or oftentimes people are operating on these conflicting interests that are literally at loggerheads with each other. And she certainly is in that position. As you said, there's a lot of things going on. First, she is she is insulted in many ways, as you said, that she's not just that she's married to this, in some sense, cowardly man, but that he had the effrontery to make it public as well by virtue of being cowardly so that other people could see it. So there's that. So it's like, if it was private and, I know this guy's a coward, but I live a nice life and, I'm kind of in control here, it would have been all right. But to your point, there's a fundamental level, at a deeper level, almost into her physical level, where, if I was with a stronger man, I'd be a happier person. And, that's in some sense, she, allows herself to be, for lack of a better word, enveloped by Wilson in the evening by virtue to have that feeling. But also to your point, having her husband find it in himself, simultaneously, breaks the world of convenience that she's learned to live in as well, and that she's had advantages with. I mean, I have a nice, wealthy life. I go on these vacations, and people write about me in the paper, and I'm well known, and this, that, and the other. And she's probably living very comfortably. So, the fact that because what would a truly dominant man realize it would be what Wilson realizes the moment he met her, that this woman is in some sense no good. That this is a woman taking advantage of a situation, a woman who, even in just persisting with a relationship in which a guy, debases himself this way, is cruel, is who uses that cruelty as a cudgel, as you will. And so, she realizes that, it's almost like she realizes that judgment will come her way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Actually, that's a very interesting point. I recently watched an interview with Tucker Carlson and Jordan Peterson. It was a brief interview, but very illuminating. And in the final moment of the interview, Tucker Carlson asked him, what would you leave our viewers with? And Jordan Peterson said, always act in, I forget the exact language he used, always act in a way that that you like yourself or respect yourself, right? Because, what's going on, it seems to me, is that Macomber doesn't have the balls to leave his wife, because it's convenient for her to be married to him, and it's convenient for him to be married to her, because she's this pretty thing, although not so pretty as the quote that you read, and it gives him a certain social level. He's a man married to a very attractive woman, or a woman who once was very attractive, is not so much because she's older. And that gives him a certain status, but it's a hollow status, because, and he knows it. He recognizes that his marriage is a sham, but he lacks the courage to leave. He lacks the courage to call an end to the relationship. Now, it seems to me that men in general, and I think that this is what Hemingway is sort of like pointing out in this story, and he points out in other stories, in the one that you read, the one about the abortion, the couple that talking about the abortion.
Absolutely.
That men a lot of times show their cowardice, not in combat, not when they're in a street fight or something like that. They show their cowardice with their women, which is of course a very profound and because it's very true insight. That men often show their cowardice with women because men a lot of times are afraid to be alone, and alone, not just lacking in a woman to have sex with, but lacking in the companionship of a woman, because a man naturally needs a woman in his life. And so a lot of times a man will be with a woman who is just simply not the right sort of woman that he wants to be with. Wilson says that Margot Macomber is just bad news. And yet Frances Macomber is still with her. And he recognizes that she's not the right sort. Not the right sort in social prestige or something like that, but in the sense of being a decent woman, being a woman who will support her man. And yet he's afraid of leaving her. And Hemingway, it seems to me, is pointing to how men so often are cowards with their women and allow themselves to remain in a relationship or be even stepped on in the relationship because they're so afraid of being alone. They're so afraid of the loneliness of an independent life. Hemingway himself famously got married like 4 times. And so I would think that in many ways, Hemingway was talking about his own experience, about his inability to break off the relationships that he had and simply live for himself. Because people have noted that Hemingway was constantly and forever surrounded by people. He was extraordinarily gregarious. And apart from his writing, which was one of the few, if the only times that he was alone, he was constantly surrounded with people. There are many stories of him living in Key West or Cuba, and he would live in these isolated places. And yet, some fan or some struggling young writer would show up at his door, and he'd welcome them with open arms and put them up in a room and allow this prospective writer, who usually didn't have any kind of talent at all, to stay there and listen to him because he was alone. He felt lonely. He could not stand his own company. And I think that that's really interesting. And I think it's something that we should take a lesson from, that we should learn to enjoy our own company as men. And we should also learn that a great deal of happiness can come from women. But to be dependent on your happiness on a woman is a mistake. And to be unwilling to break off a relationship because you fear to be alone is a tremendous mistake. I disagree, and I've said repeatedly that I disagree with MGTOW. I think the idea of just going alone and going your own way and just being like this lone wolf, I don't think it's healthy. I think it's actually unhealthy. But there is a difference between considering MGTOW and being on your own unhealthy and being stuck in a relationship that is no good, like Macromer is. I would, if I'd been Macromer, I would have left her years ago, because a woman like that who doesn't respect you, that corrodes the soul. That just eats away at you. I mean, if you're with a woman that whom you know just does not respect you, you're going to be miserable, because every time you look at your woman's eyes and she looks at you with disrespect, if not contempt, it's like looking at a mirror of yourself and seeing the reflection looking back at you and finding you, lacking. I mean, who would want to live that kind of life? And if your fear of being alone is why you live that sort of life, then you have to put on the big boy pants and call it quits with such a woman, right? What do you think?
I think there's a lot to that, and what's interesting is that by being a writer, Hemingway is allowing you, and also the content of what he writes, he's allowing you to see the extremes of both ends. So yes, absolutely. When you're in this, a relationship which, neither wants, but neither is afraid, or neither has the courage to end it. It's a continual corrosive element for all involved. And yet it's self-perpetuating, because like the deeper you're in it, the more your prior commitment syndrome kicks in, and the more the increasing lack of confidence you have in yourself to actually make the decision. So it just gets worse and worse and worse. And this is why I think in a lot of instances, I've seen guys who, allow themselves to be in a debased enough position to just almost force their significant other to just break off the relationship with them. Like, why do you have all this, porn on your computer? Or why are you talking so flagrantly with these other women? And it's just break it off for me, because I can't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
But to your point, the other extreme, and this is why I think Hemingway as a writer, or any writer, is going to highlight this, in like the fear of being alone. Because think about it, a writer at his best of times, doing his work, is an exercise as being alone in a very strong way at that typewriter or that keyboard, or however you're writing your stories. And you're, in some sense, having to create this world, this story, this narrative that's going to move people in some way. It's a very isolating existence. It's a very isolating activity. So if you try to put two and two together, the fact that Hemingway needed to be around people is no surprise to me, but he must have faced this conflict of needing the company of people, needing the vitality of being with people, and yet having the necessary drive to be alone, to be fundamentally alone and document what he's seeing. And that extreme, no doubt, probably is why you see a lot of writers, especially at that time, find themselves prone to drink, prone to excesses, prone to suicide. In fact, that is what happened to Hemingway himself. In fact, the cause of Hemingway's suicide, maybe it's a tangent, but I kind of want to go into it a little bit, because, I think it's related to probably him getting older, or you're not losing a little bit of his, vitality or what have you. And one of the reasons I want to bring it up, because some of us, or at least of my generation, may also be well aware of another writer closer to us, Hunter Thompson. Right. The journalist Hunter Thompson. We probably love Johnny Depp in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Some of us probably have read a lot of Hunter Thompson. Around the same age as well, or maybe a little older, when Hunter was 67-ish, I think, is when he blew his brains out. And I think he even had written about Hemingway going to catch him to kill himself in the years before. So we've probably felt this, a writer we like go through. So
let me go into it, the specific details, so that we're all on the same page. For those of you that don't know, Hemingway would kill himself, and let me just check the year. It slips on in 61. And he killed himself in the following way. He was 62 years old at that time. And this is more or less what had happened to him. Of course, he had a very successful career as a short story writer and as a novelist. Do keep in mind that at that time, in the 20s and 30s and 40s, short stories were a thing. And they were published by major magazines. Now we only have the New Yorker, really, that publishes new short stories. But in those years, lots of magazines would publish short stories, the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and all of the magazines. And there were different gradings of short story writers. And of course, Hemingway was at the very top because he was an acknowledged master. Now, he also published novels. The novels were, we're not getting, I don't think we have the time to get into them, but they were not as artistically as successful as his short stories. His short stories are really where it's at insofar as his artistry. And they were great novels and a lot of fun to read. But there is a sense that he was writing the novels a little bit, not a cash grab, but because it was the commercially viable thing to do. And whereas with the stories, there was a sense that he was, as an artist, really interested in the form. Okay, but that's for a different conversation that we're unfortunately not going to have enough time for. But to continue, his last major novel was actually what you would really consider a long short story. It was The Old Man and the Sea. And for The Old Man and the Sea, and the rest of his body of work, he received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Now, this was in 54, 55, I believe. And after that, there was a clear descent in his mental faculties. Now, a lot of people have theorized why this was. There's a sense that, first of all, he did suffer a brain injury in the First World War when he was 18, 19-year-old man. And it was a very severe wound. And there's no question that that might have played into his basically a slow descent into dementia. There's also a sense that some believe that maybe he had the beginnings of Alzheimer's. There's also the sense that he was a big drinker for most of his life, and that might have affected his mental faculties. The point is that he had a steady mental decline after he received the Nobel Prize. On a personal note, and this is pure speculation on my part, it could be that as an artist and as a man, he realized that he had done all that he really could and that there was no other mountaintop for him to climb. I actually suspect that, but that's a private supposition. I have no evidence for it and no exclusive insight into this, but it's a suspicion I have. I've always had it very strongly. Anyway, he deteriorated more and more. He actually wound up going to the Mayo Clinic for essentially electroshock therapy, which actually worsened his condition. And now with more modern understanding of how the brain works, yeah, certainly the kind of electroconvulsive therapy would have probably, screwed up his wiring, his brain wiring, even worse than it already was at that time. Now it's clear that electroconvulsive therapy is the worst possible thing for people who are suffering neurological degeneration, as he was suffering. So anyway, it got to a point that he was blanking out. He was just losing track of things. And in a very deliberate sense, he killed himself in Ketchum, Idaho in 1961. He famously shot himself with his favorite shotgun. And according to friends who knew him, he said it was his shotgun. He considered his shotgun like a brother. And so in a very real sense, it was a deliberate act, a very clear act of just surrender. On a personal level, I tend to think that it was a very smart move. I personally would probably do the same as him if I felt that my faculties were going and that there was just, more deterioration and not a life worth living. And I think that that was his calculation. His calculation was that, I'm going downhill. There's nothing really to stop it. I'm going to get worse and worse and more pathetic. And everything that I worked for will become almost like a footnote to this pathetic old man who's, drooling. And he killed himself. I personally respect that. I think that it is a wise way to live, of deciding when you exit the scene and not allowing circumstances to dictate them to you. But just to clarify, I have two close friends who committed suicide. I'm opposed to suicide, vehemently opposed to suicide, just because you have like a shitty period in your life. It happens to everybody. Here we're talking about an old man who was, losing it in a obvious and almost pathetic way at this point. And there was simply no hope of any kind of return to what he had once been. It wasn't just, a momentary bad fortune that led him to commit suicide. As the two friends that I have mentioned, they had simply momentary periods of bad fortune that, had they just, endured and carried on, those periods of bad fortune would have not only been in their rearview mirror, but they would have probably looked back on those periods of bad fortune and realized how much strength they gained from overcoming those bad episodes. You see? And that's something that I want to emphasize to people listening, that in my own experience in my own life, that terrible things that have happened to me, and also in the lives of other people whom I knew very, very well and who had terrible things happen to them, who did commit suicide or who did not commit suicide. Often as not, those horrible, horrible, horrible things that happen to you in your life are the very source of your strength for your future life. It's only when you get to a situation like Hemingway, where his mental faculties were decaying, decaying by leaps and bounds, going straight to the bottom. There, I understand his decision and I respect it, and it's something that I fully agree with and would probably do in his own shoes. So anyway, that's what happened.
No, yeah, there's a lot there that is really interesting to respond to. One, absolutely, agree on the physicality aspect of it, and the idea that there's a difference between suicide because you're sad or you feel like nothing's going to happen, and another one which is you are dying in a very physical way, and there's some sense of dignity with that death. So cards on the table. There's Alzheimer's history in my father and mother's family, and my father's mother died from it. He said, he, in a non-joking way, says to me, if it happens to me, you put a silver bullet in my head. That's he's very, it's like I get it, that kind of thing. And the other piece with Hemingway, because I think there's probably elements of that, and it's, you can't disassociate the decline in mental faculty or the challenge in mental faculty with arguments I've heard against his later writings. Now, this is what the critics say, not, you can take it or leave it. They're like, because I heard this from Gore Vidal, I heard this from Harold Bloom, that he never progressed, or shall we say, not never progressed, but let's say he reached a plateau of which, certain, writing was. Now, you can agree with that, you cannot, but if Hemingway recognized with Old Man in the Sea, it's like, I've reached the climax of which, no more can go, that's a real existential funk for a writer. And if it's paired with the, part of the drive of it is the physical faculties under duress, or an irrevocable decline, it's gonna weigh on you even more. This is certainly, I think, the case with, and why I bring up, Hunter, because I think there's so much parallel to it. And even in his suicide note, because he died in a very similar way. He said, I'm 67, that's 17 more years than I wanted or cared for. He's now became a sort of parody of himself. He was slurring. He always kind of slurred his speech a little bit, but it was really bad near the end. And, I think I'm exiting on my own terms at this point.
I think that's a respectable position.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, I think I reached a conclusion, but yeah. And part of the reason that, I bring it up, because I think, again, they're both writers whose writing was in some way encapsulated by or encouraged by their vitality. We know that Hemingway went out and he was at this, all these various safaris. He did go to war, this and the other. For Hunter Thompson, same thing. He went to the various political conventions. He was in the, Grant Park during the, the 68, campaign. The fact that guys known for, in some sense, being men who are doing things can no longer do things, it doesn't just harm their physical presence as men in the world, it also harms their creative sense, because it's so fundamentally tied to it.
Yeah, and here's something else that, by the way, a couple of things I didn't mention. Number one, I'd forgotten to say that after his Nobel Prize win, he went to Africa, and he was in not one but two airplane crashes, small airplane crashes, right? And he was severely injured in both of them. Okay. And so that added to his mental decline after he got the Nobel Prize. That was one point. And the other point that I wanted to mention, and this is very key to those who are interested in Hemingway, I would suggest you read the 49 stories, the first 49 stories, and The Old Man and the Sea, and For Whom the Bell Tolls, one of the major novels. And yeah, but be careful, because what happened was that after Hemingway died, a lot of his unpublished work was published. Now, you have to keep in mind, Hemingway, pretty much throughout his career, could publish whatever he wanted. And it was quite frankly a money grab on the part of his publishers and his heirs to publish a whole bunch of works. I mean, several novels of his after he had died, novels or parts of novels or fragments or what have you, that he had not published in his lifetime, but could have. Okay. And this work is just, just not worth reading because he, as a writer, didn't want this published. He could have had it published, but he didn't want it published. So that's a good enough reason not to read it. And it's substandard. I mean, because as a writer, you're always doing stuff that's really good and some of it that's kind of crappy. And sometimes you go through months where most of what you write is crappy. And then later you look at it and you're like, oh, well, those months were lost. And you just put that work away and never really look at it, but you don't want it published. Okay. So be careful what you read. I would suggest you start with the 49 stories because these 49 stories, the first 49 stories, are the pinnacle of his art form, of his craft. The first 3 stories were written at the time of publication of the book, but the rest of the stories are in chronological order, so you see the clear development of him. And going back to what you were saying, Dr. Benway, about people like Gore Vidal saying that he had plateaued. Well, it's perfectly natural for a writer to plateau. It's perfectly natural for an artist to reach a certain style, a way of doing something, and that style works for him. For instance, in my own case, as a YouTuber, I started out trying to emulate Casey Neistat, but with more profound subjects or more with more ideas, not just empty images as he tends to do. And I tried to do that, of taking out the camera and filming myself doing different things and talking to the camera about whatever topic I wanted to discuss. I found that it was just not for me. And little by little, over, I don't know, a couple hundred videos, I wound up with the style that I have, which is very minimalist, but with multiple cameras and the editing techniques that I've been using of overlap and all the rest of it. All that was a natural development. And so now I have a peculiar and specific style insofar as YouTube is concerned. Okay, I've plateaued, if you will, but there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with plateauing insofar as your style is concerned. And I'm referring to something as trivial as YouTube videos or as something like Hemingway's literary style. That he plateaued, well, so what? That I don't think is a valid criticism. What I do think is a valid criticism is that some of his later work, like Across the River into the Trees, for instance, which was published in his lifetime, is not the best work. He went out on top with Old Man and the Sea and his short stories, and leave it at that. But so what? It's a tremendous achievement. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that just about every writer after Hemingway went through a period of copying Hemingway. Just as every novelist after Salinger's Catcher in the Rye tried to write their own version of Catcher in the Rye. I mean, like, for instance, you have Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth. That's a J.D. Salinger ripoff. And then there's The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, her only novel. And that's another ripoff of Catcher in the Rye, only with a girl instead of a guy, right? You have all of these writers. I myself wrote a novel that was sort of like a ripoff of that when I was a kid, when I was like 19, right? Everybody goes through that period of copying Salinger. Well, before Salinger, everybody copied Hemingway. Even Salinger copied
I was going to bring up a story that I think is very Hemingway-esque, which is Perfect Day for Banana Fish.
Yeah, exactly. And it is extremely Hemingway-esque. All surface, the whole iceberg theory approach, and there's another thing that I have forgotten to mention in this whole conversation that is really important. And it's the phrase that encapsulates Hemingway, his own phrase. It's grace under pressure. Grace under pressure was his ideology. And he said it. And I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but, well, better late than never. And that approach is so anathema to the current fashion. And yet, I would venture to say, and this is like leaving Hemingway aside and sort of like taking Hemingway's ideas and applying it to masculinity today. That notion of grace under pressure, of not bitching and complaining and moaning like a little fucking pussy about whatever is going on, of not being so solipsistic, and presenting a graceful, strong facade to the outside world, even as you endure the pressure of whatever it is. I think that's something that we should all be aspiring towards. I think that Hemingway has a lot to offer young men today. What do you think?
Absolutely. I'm a little bit tongue tied because I think it's so apparent. And in my regard, I think, let me put it in the terms of a family. And I may reference another movie, but what the hell, it happens.
Sure. Go ahead.
Part of what I would consider a father that you need in order to get through is, in some sense, that grace under pressure, and that because there are hierarchical or at least differentiated roles in relationships and in families. And one of the things I always expect of a father is under duress, and the father is going to be well aware of duress, but he's going to have to power through it by virtue of making sure that everybody else can power through it. And there is order and resilience in that kind of structure. You see it there's two films I bring up that you could see this slightly differently. One is the famous line from The Godfather during the speech in the garden. The line, women and children can be careless, but not men.
Right.
It's one of the most important lines in that whole situation. And, what the Godfather does it. He's aware that people are going to try and kill him and his son, but you have to go methodically through everything. And even if I repeat myself, because we cannot be careless, we have to have order and control. And Michael Corleone is nothing if not, the stone-faced, to the point of cruelty manifestation of that.
No
question. The other element of it is, you may have seen this movie, and it was a book as well. The Ice Storm. I think the ending of the Ice Storm. So, the Ice Storm is very much. It's best description of this book is like, imagine if John Updike's book Couples, which is about literally people running around fucking each other for fun. Their baby. Imagine that story written from the perspective of their kids.
Right.
And the Ice Storm, there's a key party of the family, a family who's kind of, in a relationship where neither wants to be involved. There's weakness. Everybody's cheating on each other who wants to. And the father, and after like a series of very strong and odd and disturbing events happens, not just to this family, but to the people around them, everybody gets into a car and at the train station where they're picking up their kid, and the father just literally breaks down crying. That is a profound moment of, it's an honesty, but it's a manifestation of the extreme disorder having taken hold, that the father, the orderly figure, the man who can handle the duress, even though, he may not be a perfect guy, he can handle it, can't do it. And father breaks down and cries. I'm sure people, especially the author of that book, thinks there's something, beautiful in it. And maybe it is beautiful, but to me, it's a dark beauty, because that family is doomed at this point. If father can't maintain.
If the father can't keep his shit together, he's going to be killed by the other New York families. That's what it's basically saying. Because, in Godfather, both the book and the movie, Mario Puzo was a man's man, okay? And Francis Coppola, right? And they're basically saying the same thing, that, women and children can be careless, men cannot. Yeah, I remember the scene in the movie with what's his name, Kevin Kline, breaking down like a little fucking bitch and weeping like a fucking pussy. I mean, basically being careless. That Coppola and Mario Puzo warned against, because it's true. You, as a man, cannot afford to be careless. Women and children can be careless, and they often are. We always have to remember that women are essentially children. They are ruled by their emotions just as infants are. Hemingway is basically saying to men is, you have to be a man. Grace under pressure. Grace under pressure means you keep your shit organized, no matter how much pressure. External pressure, chaos. That it seems to me that people don't really realize about Hemingway. He was a man, as I said at the beginning of the stream, he was highly neurotic. Neurotic, I'm talking about in the sense of the psychologically neurotic, the psychological category of neuroticism. He was neurotic, and yet he controlled himself. He did not allow his feelings to overwhelm him or dictate what he would do. He exhibited grace under pressure, his internal pressure, and he controlled it and projected out into the world this strong, masculine, virile persona, which was who he was. It wasn't a fake, but it was not overshadowed by the emotional turmoil that he suffered. He controlled it. And that's what, what men should be. Because these blubbering fucking pussies who cry over every little fucking thing, that's not a man. That's a weakling. A weakling who, in the parlance of The Godfather, will be killed by Don Barzini, will be killed by, Hyman Roth.
Not just himself, but his family and his posterity will be killed.
Yes. Or not killed in the literal sense, but certainly in the metaphorical sense.
Yeah.
Certainly in the sense of like women, for instance, who have like daddy issues because their daddy was not around or daddy was a weakling, right? And how do they act? They act like whores. And because of they will and become just broken women of no value. The father had been a man and had, demanded of them certain attitudes and certain behaviors and certain standards. They would be whole, these young women. They would be whole, they would be healthy. They would have a blossoming soul, and they would be good mothers and good wives and good women who would contribute to society, and not these fucking whores that they are to be, fucking every cock around, which I think is disgusting. Today, and Hemingway is the anti-fashion of today. But Hemingway is the man you should be. And that's my prescription to everybody here. There's some questions in the chat, so go ahead.
I was going to say, and this may be too soft on my part, but I would also stress that one of the lessons you get from the story is, even in a position of debasement that Mackmer is in, Mackmer still has the path out to his courage, to manliness. That it isn't like a predestination thing here where there are cucks in this world and there are a few alpha males and so be it. There is a struggle at the core of it. Yes, some people are gonna not make it through, but there is a struggling path out of it, if you will, even if it's in a minute and concentrated and ultimately short-lived form.
Yeah. We're coming up on 2 hours, and I always think that 2 hours is plenty for a stream. Once I did a 6-hour stream, and that was excessive. Okay, what are your last thoughts? Closing out thoughts about Hemingway. I'm really curious about that. What do you think? You are a young man. Hemingway died in 1961. He is he's got almost 100 years on you in terms of age. How do you read him today? How does he speak to you today? I'm curious.
To me, he's a manifestation of a life that we should want to live, but is perhaps in many direct ways denied us. Like I said, when I read Hemingway, I do see, and keep in mind, I have a much older father than me. He's 40 years older than me. He was 40 when I was born. Mm-hmm. So even, it's not like I had, soy boy father or a Generation X father who, was concerned about my feelings, what have you. I have a father old enough, and, by virtue of seeing his father alive, had seen this manifestation of how a man is going to conduct himself in a way that, is not toxic in the sense that, it's just out to destroy you. It's actually out to do good by you. It's actually there to teach you how to not just to protect you as a kid, but to show you how you can also go forth and protect yourself and protect the people around you who you care for. Right. It was so refreshing to finally get in and deep into this story and read it, because I do read a lot of older stories, what have you, and I've seen the style and everything, but just the attitude of the man on the frontier, as you will, or the man in this environment of Africa, freed from the particularities of civilization that restrains one from being somewhat, the core animalistic / core nature of man, was refreshing to me. And, it's just, it energized me. I read it over again last night. And, I was like, really in the mood to just I want to fucking talk about this. I don't know, and just exhibit it, So I'm probably ranting a little bit or repeating myself, but that's the tone I felt.
Well, the thing that I find about Hemingway is that, first of all, I wish I had known him because, like you, there's a sense that, look, the caricature of him is that he's like a big He-Man kind of rough and grumbly kind of guy. But the reality is that he seems to me like a man who wanted young men to be better than who they were and to help them to become better men. All right. And I think that that's incredibly valuable because a lot of this feminist shit, this SJW crap, refers to quote unquote toxic masculinity. And it looks at masculinity as if it's merely dominance, which is idiotic. Okay. I can speak to you as a father. I have a small child, a small 2-year-old boy, 3 years old almost. Now, you see, a thing of great satisfaction that I had. We were at some play place, where little kids play and they run around and it's all carpeted with rubber and they're perfectly safe, right? And there were like these little motorcycles, the plastic motorcycles, of course, that suitable for 2- and 3-year-olds, right? And so my son wanted me to put him on the motorcycle, to just pick him up like his mother, to just pick him up and put him on the motorcycle. And so he, run around, mounted on this little plastic motorcycle. And instead of me just picking him up and putting him on the motorcycle like his mother would, I taught him how to put his leg over the motorcycle, how to hold on to the handlebar and toss his leg over the motorcycle and mount it himself. And that was much more satisfying because, see, of course, I am a nearly 50-year-old man and my son is not quite 3 years old. Of course, I am the dominant male, quote unquote. But, see, my task, my purpose, my objective is not to lord it over the small child. No, of course not. That would be idiotic on my part. My purpose is to teach this boy how to mount the plastic motorcycle so that he doesn't need me anymore for this particular task, of course. He's going to need me for other tasks, much more complex tasks as he grows through life. But you see, in this particular trivial task of him mounting a motorcycle, it was more important for me to teach him to do it than to simply pick him up and put it on top of him. Because that way, he learns something, he grows. And that's what, as a man, gave me enormous satisfaction. That I was teaching this 3-year-old boy, this 2.5-year-old boy at the time, how to mount the plastic motorcycle. And eventually, after 2-3 tries, he realized, oh yeah, just grab it here, just throw my leg over and I'm on it. And I can go wherever I want. And I don't need mommy and I don't need daddy. Okay?
Right.
And that's that sense that he had, because later I saw him hopping on a motorcycle. He didn't care about mommy. He didn't care about daddy. He was on his own, playing with his little friends and doing, things that 2.5-year-olds do. But that independence is, as a man, what I want my son to have. And yet our society seems to be fomenting the notion that the child should depend on the mother and should do nothing except what the mother provides for him. The feminization of young men today is that sense that the woman will do everything for the boy and the boy will be helpless. And if a child grows up feeling that he is helpless, he will grow into a weak man. And so the idea is that as a man, I have to teach my son to mount the little plastic motorcycle by himself, to learn how to tie his shoes, to do everything so he doesn't need me, so that he is independent and strong and can go out in the world and make a place for himself without my assistance, without needing to depend on me or his mother. That's the goal of being a man, of quote unquote toxic masculinity, which is not toxic, of course. It's, on the contrary, very necessary. But our contemporary society dismisses and looks down upon the masculine contribution to child rearing, the masculine contribution to our society. It dismisses it. And we as men have to say, hey, I'm here. I'm going to elbow my way to a place on the table. And if you don't like it, fuck off. I offended you? Oh, I'm sorry. Just ignore them. Ignore them and just go. Does this make any sense, or am I ranting too?
Nope. No, that's perfectly. That's the case. I mean, the goal of all of this is to ensure the survival of posterity. in a very, I mean, and not just like, not even just survival and like eking out an existence and reproducing. It's like
Flourishing.
flourishment
Yes.
and fulfillment. You want, I mean, and it's funny, like this will be in like a work setting, but it's still true. Like a good manager, a good work leader doesn't just want to keep hiring underlings. He says, I want to hire and find those people who could replace me if I so want.
Exactly. And I want to raise a boy who won't need me by the time he's an adult, and who will want to be with me, of course, but he won't need me to flourish because I will have given him all the tools and all the independence and self-confidence to be able to move forward out into the world. And it seems precisely that which our society denigrates, precisely what Hemingway teaches, that grace under pressure of like, facing your fear and controlling your fear and moving forward. That's something to emulate. Okay, let me just quickly check up on. Hey, I'm glad I'm reading some of your chats here, and you guys apparently enjoyed my rant. So I'm so glad. And listen, so we've been going on for 2 hours, so I'm going to call it a book stream. I want to thank very much Dr. Benway for having joined me on this conversation. It's a pleasure as always, Dr. Benway. And by the way, for you guys who don't know, Dr. Benway is going to be launching a channel in a little bit. He's getting his act organized, and he's going to be launching a channel with some content on it. And that's why he's sort of like postponing it until he has that content, so that people go to his channel and there's more than just one welcome video. And I think that it's going to be terrific content, and I really look forward to checking it out. I would suggest you guys just subscribe to his channel right away. Dr. Benway, I don't know if your channel is up yet, but if it is, just subscribe to him or write it down, because he's just a terrific guest, and he's just a smart guy, and I'm sure his content is going to be superb. And finally, before we go, I wanted to ask you guys, what novel would you guys like to read for the next book stream in a couple of weeks? Let me tell you the ones that we have on offer. Here we are. Wait. Here we go. Okay, these are the books. It is Tim Wu's The Attention Merchants, Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb, J.D. Unwin's Sex and Culture, and Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. I heard Mein Kampf is a coming of age novel, I think.
I may be aware of something about that. It's about how did I Bildungsroman. Tell me how I came up. It's a man telling you how he came to his view of the world. Interestingly enough, that man is Adolf Hitler, and his view is Nazism, but so be it.
Okay, let's really quickly go through these novels, so I'll give you a little bit of an explanation. Tim Wu's The Attention Merchants is basically about the culture of the internet, but it starts much earlier. It starts with newspapers in the 19th century and talks about the development of newspapers and media, movies, then TV, and now the internet and social media, and how these different media didn't exist 200 years ago, and they have flowered, especially as of late, and they capture more and more of our attention and take us away from other things that are important in our lives. And it's both a history and a critique of it. And it's very interesting from what I've been able to page through so far. Now, Anti-Fragile, Nassim Taleb's book, I've read it now twice. I think it's fantastic. The idea is very simple. He says that there are three states. There's something that is fragile. That means that if you exert any kind of pressure on it, it will break. There is something that is robust, which means that if you exert any kind of pressure on it, it will remain unchanged. And then there's something that is anti-fragile, whereby if you exert pressure on it, it becomes stronger. Now, Taleb goes on and on about he was never able to find a better word for this, but it's actually very good because you understand what it means. It means that more pressure, the stronger it gets. For example, your bones. The more you jump, the more you run, the more pressure you exert on your bones, the stronger they become. And this is noted with astronauts when they go into outer space and they're in zero gravity for a prolonged period of time. When they come back, their bones are extraordinarily brittle. And in point of fact, they have to be very careful that they don't break especially their shins, apparently, because of the brittleness of their bones, because there's no pressure and zero gravity, of course. And so their bones just get weak, and they get strong again when they're back on Earth because of gravity, because of the pressure on their bones, because of gravity. Okay, now this is a very interesting book, and it's been very illuminating to me. Now, J.D. Unwin's Sex and Culture. This book is no longer in print, but you can easily find it in PDF for free online. J.D. Unwin, Sex and Culture, and it is just a phenomenal book, and I highly recommend it. Because it teaches. Basically, the thesis of the book is that women's virtuousness defines the vitality of a culture. That is, if a woman is chaste, if she's not allowed to have sex before marriage, and after marriage she has to remain monogamous, and it is socially imposed, and men therefore cannot have sex unless they are married, and it is socially pressured into this situation, that culture will have more vitality than a culture where women's sexuality is more free. And J.D. Unwin's thesis is that as a culture develops, a chaste culture develops, it becomes more and more successful, like the Roman Empire, where Roman women were expected to be virgins before they married and remain chaste to their husbands during marriage. But as the empire grew, the sexual mores were loosened up, and women eventually were able to do whatever they want, sexually speaking, before or after marriage. And J.D. Unwin tracks how that had an impact on the Roman Empire, and it eventually decayed. And he said that this paradigm, where there's more sexual freedom, not to say sexual decadence, is a sure sign of the decay of a civilization, which has a lot of interesting implications for our own civilization. So that's why I'm very interested in having a group discussion of that. And then there's Hitler's Mein Kampf, like a Bildungsroman about some obscure little, I think he was an Austrian painter. I don't know. Benway, you're going to have to...
I heard it said he was a vegetarian.
Vegetarian, that's it. And yeah, and he was a teetotaler. He didn't drink and he didn't smoke. Yeah. And went out and invaded the world.
He did a couple things.
Yeah. By the way, Observing Libertarian gave us a super chat of $5. Thank you very much, Observing Libertarian. He says, David Copperfield remains my favorite. It gave us the Micawber principle, which liberals still to this day fail to comprehend consistently. David Copperfield, actually, I read it years ago, but I have forgotten it. I'll have to look through it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Observing Libertarian. So, guys, which book would you like to read? I'm asking you all. Attention Merchants, Anti-Fragile, Sex and Culture, or Mein Kampf? I'll be waiting here for your replies in the live chat. Anybody who throws a super chat, the first one, oh no, we can go highest bidder. Highest bidding super chat. Yeah, let's do that. Highest bidding super chat will do the book that he wants, and we'll read it, and in 2 weeks we'll do another one. Yeah? Okay, somebody says mine, somebody says Sex and Culture. Sex and Culture, Mein Kampf, Sex and Culture. A lot of people seem to be wanting Sex and Culture. Okay, let's do Sex and Culture. Okay, Sex and Culture, like I said, you can find it for free. We're gonna do, Sex and Culture, done. We're gonna do Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin. I'm putting it in the chat right now. Hang on a second. Let me just copy paste because I'm too lazy to type. It's going right there. We go. I just put it just so that you know how to write it. Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin. It can be found for free online. Just Google that name and the title, and it'll be in a PDF. Now, the book is about like 700 pages long, but here's a little, cliff notes or a little tip. The important thing is the conclusion chapter, okay? Because of the 740 odd pages, something like 300 are citations and footnotes and where he got his information. I mean, it's incredibly detailed. Because to give you a background, J.D. Unwin was an anthropologist in the 1930s in the 1930s. He died, I believe, in 1935 or something like that. And he died as a relatively young man. He was only 41, I believe, when he died. But I could be wrong, but he was a young guy. Anyway, the point is, he wrote this book, and this was when anthropology was serious, not the bullshit that is taught in school today, in colleges today, which is just SJW crap. J.D. Unwin is persona non grata in anthropology today because he didn't believe in the tabula rasa, and he came to certain conclusions that are really, really uncomfortable. Now, here's the key issue about sex and culture. It is incredibly well-researched. He has 300 pages of footnotes and citations and where he got his information and data. He has another 300 pages where he meticulously builds his argument. The key parts to read are the introduction and the conclusions. Once you have those, which altogether are something like 40 pages, I would suggest you go through the whole book and look through it carefully so you get a sense of, every step in his argument. Okay? So even though it's a 700-page book, don't be afraid. It's really what you're going to have to read is, I would venture to say, something like 70 pages, less than 100 pages. And his style is a bit dusty, but he is right on the money insofar as his logic. It's very sound. And that's why the book is so unpopular among academics today, because it's almost impossible to refute him because he was so meticulous in his analysis, meticulous in bringing his proof to bear on every single one of his premises. He's the man, okay? And he's what an anthropologist should be, and I highly recommend him. Dr. Medway, I hope you guys will join me for Sex and Culture in 2 weeks' time. You up for it?
Yeah, let's talk. Let's see if we can make it happen.
Yeah, because it's a great book. And so I want to thank Dr. Benway, and I want to thank the audience, and I want to thank everybody on the Super Chat. That was very kind of you. And so until 2 weeks from today, when we'll be talking about J.D. Unwin's Sex and Culture. All the best.
Take care.